August 17, 1942, Rouen-Sotteville, France. The briefing room at Abbeville-Drucat smelled of cigarette smoke and leather when Hauptmann Josef Priller of Jagdgeschwader 26 received intelligence reports describing the American heavy bombers approaching the French post at 23,000 feet, a formation of 12 Boeing B-17E flying fortresses from the 97th Bombardment Group making their first penetration into occupied Europe with orders to strike the rail yards at Rouen-Sotteville. The Luftwaffe had been tracking Allied bomber development since 1940, and while British operations typically peaked around 18,000 feet, where Messerschmitt Bf-109 F-4s performed optimally, these American formations were consistently operating 3,000 to 5,000 feet higher, yet German intelligence officers repeatedly minimized reports about General Electric turbochargers installed on Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, dismissing them as marginal advantages that couldn't compensate for what they perceived as inadequate defensive armament and poor formation discipline. Priller's swarm lifted off at 0915 hours into humid air that pressed against the canopy like wet wool. 4 Bf-109 F-4s climbing through scattered cumulus at maximum continuous power, their Daimler-Benz DB601E engines screaming at 2,600 RPM as altimeters wound past 6,000 meters, where the air turned thin and cold enough to frost the gunsight glass. At 7,000 meters, the Messerschmitts began to struggle, manifold pressure dropping as the single-stage superchargers reached their operational ceiling, throttle response becoming sluggish, while the pilots compensated with constant trim adjustments to maintain formation, their breath condensing inside oxygen masks that smelled of rubber and stale exhalation. The B-17s appeared as dark crosses against white cloud at 7,100 meters, holding steady at 180 miles per hour in a tight defensive box that bristled with 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. And when Priller pushed his stick forward to dive for an attack run, he felt the controls grow mushy in the oxygen-starved air, his rate of climb barely 400 feet per minute, while the bombers maintained altitude effortlessly on their turbocharged engines that compressed thin atmosphere back to sea-level density. The first firing pass came from 11 o'clock high, cannon shells arcing toward the lead fortress as tracers from 10 defensive positions converged on Priller's approaching fighter. The Mauser MG 151/20 cannons bucking with their distinctive hammer blow recoil that shook the entire airframe. But at this altitude, the Messerschmitt's performance had degraded so severely that closing speed was insufficient for accurate gunnery, shells passing behind the bomber's tail section as American gunners walked their fire across empty sky, where the Messerschmitt had been 3 seconds earlier. Priller's wingman, Unteroffizier Anton Hackel, radioed that his engine temperature was climbing past operational limits, the DB601E laboring in air so thin that cooling efficiency had dropped 30%, forcing him to reduce power and fall away from the formation, just as flak from American ships in the Channel began bursting at 22,000 feet, black puffs of 88mm fragmentation that hung in the sky like smudged thumbprints. The bombers released their payload at 0947 hours, 36,000 pounds of general-purpose ordnance tumbling toward marshalling yards where locomotives sat in neat rows. And while several bombs cratered sidings and destroyed a repair facility, the formation turned west without losing a single aircraft, their turbochargers maintaining full power at altitudes where German fighters gasped and shuddered. Back at Abbeville-Drucat, Priller's after-action report documented the engagement with clinical precision: 3 attack runs, 0 confirmed kills, 340 rounds of 20mm expended, maximum attack altitude 7,200 meters, enemy formation altitude 7,100 meters. But his marginal notes revealed growing concern about American technological advantages that Luftwaffe technical officers continued to downplay in their assessments. The intelligence summary filed that evening to Luftwaffe 3 headquarters acknowledged that American bombers operated comfortably above 7,000 meters, but attributed their survival to heavy defensive armament rather than engine performance, recommending increased fighter strength rather than technical modifications, a conclusion that would prove catastrophic as American bomber streams grew from 12 aircraft to formations of 300. In Washington, analysts at Wright Field examined combat reports with satisfaction, noting that General Electric's Type B-2 turbocharger had performed exactly as designed, using exhaust gas energy to spin a turbine at 21,000 RPM that drove a centrifugal compressor capable of maintaining sea-level manifold pressure up to 25,000 feet. A system that added 300 pounds to each engine installation, but provided altitude performance that no German fighter could match without extensive redesign. The sun set over the English Channel at 20:43 hours, casting long shadows across cratered French rail yards where work crews already labored to restore damaged track, while in German fighter cockpits, pilots who had just encountered their first high-altitude American formation began to understand that the war in the vertical dimension had fundamentally changed. October 14, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. The operations order called for 291 Boeing B-17F and B-17G flying fortresses from the 1st and 3rd Bombardment Divisions to strike ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt in what would become known as Black Thursday, the deepest unescorted penetration into German airspace attempted to date, with mission planners at 8th Air Force Headquarters calculating that destruction of these facilities would cripple Wehrmacht armor production within 3 months, though this calculation failed to account for dispersed manufacturing capacity and German stockpiling programs that had anticipated such attacks. Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader 2 received scramble orders at 13:20 hours from his base at Beaumont-le-Roger, leading 16 Bf-109 G6s northeast toward the bomber stream that radar stations had tracked crossing the Dutch coast at 26,000 feet. The formation so massive that Freya early warning sets initially reported it as equipment malfunction before visual observers confirmed aircraft numbers. Meyer had developed head-on attack tactics specifically to counter American defensive firepower, recognizing that the B-17's chin turret blind spot in earlier models made frontal approaches the only viable intercept geometry, and he briefed his pilots to aim for the cockpit and number 1 engine, accepting that closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour would give them less than 2 seconds of firing time before violent evasive maneuvers became necessary to avoid collision. At 13:55 hours, the Messerschmitts reached attack altitude over Bad Kreuznach, climbing through their own contrails that streaked the October sky like chalk on slate. Engine temperatures acceptable because German engineers had finally uprated the DB605A power plant with larger oil coolers and modified supercharger gearing that improved high-altitude performance, though it still fell short of American turbocharged systems. The bomber stream stretched for 12 miles, combat boxes stacked at 1,000-foot intervals from 24,000 to 27,000 feet, each fortress maintaining precise station despite turbulence that hammered the formations with sudden drops and lifts that jerked pilots against their restraint harnesses, while ball turret gunners hung beneath fuselages in cramped spheres, watching German fighters assemble in gaggles of 40 to 50 aircraft. Meyer rolled inverted and pulled through into a diving head-on pass at 400 miles per hour indicated, his illuminated Revi C/12D gun sight Pipper settling on a B-17G from the 305th Bombardment Group, and he pressed both triggers simultaneously, sending 13mm rounds from his MG-131 Cowl guns and 20mm shells from his MG-151/20 wing cannons toward the fortress in a converging cone of fire that intersected the bomber's path exactly where Meyer had calculated, except the pilot had anticipated the attack and kicked rudder at the last instant, causing the shells to pass through empty air, while 50 caliber tracers from 5 different gun positions converged on Meyer's fighter with mathematical precision. The Bf-109G shuddered as 3 rounds punched through the left wing root, one severing hydraulic lines that fed the undercarriage extension system, another fragmenting against the main spar without catastrophic structural failure, and Meyer hauled the stick back so hard that Gray tunneled his vision at 7 Gs, airspeed bleeding from 450 to 180 knots in 4 seconds as the Messerschmitt clawed upward in a maximum performance chandelle that put him 3,000 feet above the bombers, with engine temperature climbing past redline. What German pilots encountered over Schweinfurt was not the same air force they had engaged in 1942. These B-17Gs carried chin turrets with twin 50 caliber guns that eliminated the frontal blind spot. Power-operated turrets replaced hand-cranked installations, and most significantly, the bombers operated at altitudes where their turbocharged engines maintained full power, while German fighters sacrificed speed and climb rate to reach the combat zone. At 14:22 hours, Republic P-47C Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group appeared at 28,000 feet, the first American fighters capable of escorting bombers to German airspace. Their Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines equipped with General Electric CH-5 turbochargers that delivered 2,000 horsepower at altitudes where Luftwaffe fighters struggled to maintain 1,200, and the engagement geometry shifted immediately as Thunderbolts dove on German formations with speed advantages exceeding 100 miles per hour. Oberlieutenant Walter Ossow, a veteran with 123 confirmed kills, found himself in a turn-in fight with a P-47 at 26,000 feet, where his Bf-109G6 could barely hold 240 miles per hour, while the Thunderbolt maintained 300 in level flight. The American pilot using superior speed to disengage from unfavorable positions and re-engage at will, employing boom and zoom tactics that exploited altitude performance German fighters couldn't match. The bomber stream pressed on toward Schweinfurt, releasing 1,122 tons of high explosive and incendiary ordnance from 14:45 to 15:03 hours, cratering factory floors and igniting machine oil reservoirs that burned for 3 days, though post-strike reconnaissance would reveal that decentralized bearing production allowed German industry to restore output to 80% of pre-raid levels within 12 weeks. 60 B-17s failed to return to England, their crews lost over Germany or the North Sea, but American losses would have exceeded 90 aircraft without P-47 intervention, and the tactical lesson was inescapable. Turbochargers had shifted the altitude paradigm permanently, forcing Luftwaffe technical bureaus to finally acknowledge that General Electric's exhaust-driven compressor system represented a fundamental advantage that couldn't be countered with incremental supercharger improvements. In underground bunkers at Rechlin Test Facility, engineers began emergency programs to develop German turbochargers, but metallurgical limitations and resource shortages meant prototype systems wouldn't reach squadron service until early 1945, years after American fighters had established air superiority above 25,000 feet, making the Reich's industrial heartland vulnerable to daylight precision bombing that would grind German war production towards systemic collapse. The weather forecast called for broken clouds over central Germany with tops at 18,000 feet, adequate visibility for visual bombing if the formation penetrated above the overcast, and at 0820 hours, 730 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force began lifting off from English airfields with orders to strike Berlin in the first large-scale American daylight raid on the Reich capital, escorted by 801 fighters, including P-51B Mustangs from the 354th Fighter Group, whose Packard-built Merlin V1650-3 engines featured two-stage, two-speed superchargers that, combined with aftercooler systems, delivered performance curves that matched turbocharger efficiency up to 30,000 feet. Major Walter Beckham led 16 P-51Bs from Boxted at 0855 hours, climbing through rain squalls that rattled against canopies like handfuls of thrown gravel, the Merlins producing their characteristic crackling exhaust note that signaled 1,490 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, a sound that German pilots had learned to associate with aircraft that could run them down at any altitude. Over the Zuider Zee at 10:45 hours, Beckham's group rendezvoused with B-17s from the 95th Bombardment Group, holding formation at 27,000 feet, the bombers leaving contrails that hung in the frozen stratosphere like suspended ropes of ice crystal, and radio discipline held as the formation pressed east toward Brandenburg, where Luftwaffe controllers were assembling every available fighter from Jagdgeschwader 3, 11, and 54 for a maximum effort interception. At 11:38 hours, German formations appeared at 29,000 feet, not the expected Bf-109s, but twin-engined Messerschmitt Bf-110G Zerstörers, carrying underwing rocket tubes loaded with 21-centimeter Werfer Granate 21 rockets designed for standoff attacks beyond 50-caliber range, a tactical adaptation forced on the Luftwaffe by American escort fighters that now accompanied bombers throughout their entire mission profile. Beckham rolled his flight into a diving interception at 380 miles per hour indicated, the P-51's laminar flow wing producing remarkably low drag that allowed sustained high-speed flight at altitudes where earlier American fighters had suffered buffeting and control issues, and his gun sight tracked a Bf-110 in a gentle left turn at 28,000 feet, the German crew apparently unaware that American fighters could reach them at this altitude. The firing solution came together at 800 yards, Beckham's 650 caliber M2 Brownings converging on the Zerstörer's cockpit area as he pressed the trigger, watching bright tracers arc across the closing distance with lazy beauty that concealed their 2,800 feet per second velocity, and the Bf-110's right engine erupted in orange flame as incendiary rounds ignited fuel lines, the aircraft rolling inverted and falling away with both crew members visible in the canopy before it disappeared into clouds at 15,000 feet. What unfolded over Berlin between 11:45 and 12:30 hours represented the culmination of 3 years of American industrial and tactical development. P-51 Mustangs operating at 30,000 feet with fuel reserves sufficient for 4 hours of combat radius. P-47 Thunderbolts using their massive radial engines and turbochargers to clear airspace between 25,000 and 28,000 feet, and P-38 Lightnings with turbocharged Allison V-1710s providing top cover above 32,000 feet, creating a layered defensive umbrella that German fighters couldn't penetrate without accepting catastrophic losses. Oberst Gunther Lutzow, Geschwaderkommodor of Jotge III, led a staffel of Focke-Wulf FW-190A8s into the bomber stream at 26,000 feet, only to find himself immediately engaged by 8 P-47s that dove from 29,000 feet, with speed advantages his radial engine fighters couldn't match, the Thunderbolts using their superior high-altitude performance to dictate engagement terms, while Lutzow's pilots struggled with engines that lost 30% of their rated power above 7,500 meters. German flak batteries surrounding Berlin fired 9,000 rounds of 88mm and 105mm ammunition between 1200 and 1215 hours, creating a barrage that filled 60 cubic miles of airspace with fragmentation patterns. Yet American formations maintained altitude discipline at 27,000 feet, where shell bursts appeared 2,000 feet below their flight path, the difference created by turbochargers that allowed bombardiers to operate above the effective ceiling of heavy anti-aircraft fire. At 12:07 hours, the lead bombardier from the 95th toggled his release at 26,800 feet over Erkner, sending a signal that rippled through the formation as 1,800 tons of ordnance began falling toward industrial districts, warehouses, and marshalling yards, the bombs tumbling through thin air for 43 seconds before impacting with delayed action fuses that allowed penetration of reinforced structures before detonation. The Luftwaffe lost 79 fighters over Berlin and the surrounding provinces, many falling to P-51s that pursued damaged aircraft down to treetop level, accepting risks that pre-war doctrine had forbidden because American pilots understood that turbocharger technology had given them performance margins that made such aggressive tactics survivable. 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters, painful casualties that nevertheless represented a favorable exchange ratio against the defending force, and more importantly, demonstrated that American aircraft could penetrate to any target in Germany, regardless of altitude, weather, or defensive concentration. In technical intelligence reports filed at Wright-Patterson Field in Ohio, engineers noted with satisfaction that turbocharger-equipped aircraft had achieved operational goals that matched pre-war predictions, sustained combat operations above 25,000 feet, fuel efficiency that enabled 1,500-mile radius of missions, and power output that remained constant regardless of altitude, up to system limits around 30,000 feet. The Luftwaffe's dismissal of turbochargers in 1940 and 1941 seemed reasonable when German supercharged engines dominated the low-altitude battles over France and Britain. But that early assessment failed to anticipate how strategic bombing would force combat into the vertical dimension, where exhaust-driven compressors provided insurmountable advantages, and by March 1944, the Reich's fighter arm was trapped in a technological deficit that no amount of pilot skill or tactical innovation could overcome, leaving German cities exposed to daylight attack by bombers operating at altitudes their defenders could barely reach.